Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Maselli, a media officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Thank you for joining us today for a public briefing for the recently released report, The Clinical Utility of Compounded Bioidentical Hormone Therapy, a review of safety, effectiveness, and use. You can download the report and the related resources at nationalacademies.org/CBHT. Again, that's nationalacademies.org/CBHT. And the slides and recording of this webinar will be available on that page as well in the next few days. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we are private nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. For each requested study, panel members are chosen for their expertise, and they serve pro bono to carry out the study statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the entire committee, and they must undergo external peer review before they are released, as did this report. I have with me today several members of the committee to discuss the report, but before I introduce them, just want to go over a few reminders. This webinar is scheduled to last an hour and 15 minutes. We'll start with a presentation summarizing the report by the committee members, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And you can simply click that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to submit a question. And should you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can contact Zoom technical support at 1-888-799-9666 and select option 2. And now with that, I'd like to introduce the members of the committee that wrote the report who are here with us today. We have our committee chair, Donald Madison from Risk Sciences International. And we have Ruth Parker, the vice chair of the committee, who's from Emory University School of Medicine. During the Q&A period, we'll also have a number of other committee members who are here to take your questions, and they are Leslie Curtis from Duke Clinical Research Institute, Adele Carrara from University of Maryland Eastern Shore, Aaron Kesselheim from Harvard Medical School, Robert MacArthur from the Rockefeller University Hospital, Jose Manitou from the University of Connecticut, Nancy King-Ream from Columbia University, and David Rubino from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Madison to kickstart the presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie. First, I'd like to take a moment to formally thank the sponsors of this report for their invested interest and generous support of this study and its report. And that is our colleagues at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I'd also like to thank the full 12-member authoring committee for their passion, dedication, and volunteered time. To form this committee, as Stephanie alluded, the academies conducted a formal committee nomination, including a process where all proposed consensus study committees are reviewed by National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine leadership to ensure that there is an appropriate expertise, balance, diversity, and avoidance of conflicts of interest. It was a pleasure serving as committee chair for this study, and I'm grateful for each member's contribution. Additionally, one other member, Ruth Parker, the vice chair, was a great help in the development and discussion that led to this committee report. Next slide. We'll begin by providing an overview of the study's statement of task and description of the committee's research approach. We will then review the report's key messages and recommendations and conclude with a few minutes for your questions and comments. Next slide. Let's begin with the FDA's charge to the committee. An ad hoc committee of the National Academies will conduct a study to assess the clinical utility of treating patients with compounded bioidentical hormone replacement therapy drug products. The committee will review the current and historic use of compounded BHRT drug products to treat patients, including information about the medical conditions these compounded drug products have been used to treat. Describe the physical and chemical characteristics of the compounded BHRT drug products. Review and assess the available evidence or lack of evidence regarding the safety and effectiveness of compounded BHRT drug products. And finally, based on the available evidence, summarize the findings with recommendations with respect to clinical utility of the compounded BHRT products, whether the available evidence of safety and effectiveness supports use of compounded BHRT drug product treatment patients, and the patient population that might need a compounded BHRT drug product in lieu of an FDA-approved product. Next slide. Between March of 2019 and April of 2020, the committee held 9 committee meetings. In addition to the closed session meetings, 5 public information gathering sessions were held to gather additional testimony and data to inform the committee's charge. Participants in those supplemental information gathering sessions included a range of subject matter experts, including policy experts, officials representing various stakeholder organizations, for example, compounders, women's health advocates, and medical societies and members of the general public. Members of the general public were also invited to provide comments at all public meetings. Next slide. Clarifying points. Next slide. There we go. It's important to clarify a couple of specific terms and definitions used in the report. Let's begin with the term bioidentical, which means compounds would be identical to an endogenous product, that is, with respect to structure. As a consequence of CBHT marketing strategies, the term bioidentical is often misrepresented or misunderstood by the general public. The committee intentionally includes the term bioidentical, referencing certain types of hormone therapies, with the rationale that the term bioidentical serves as an important identifier for many compounded hormone therapies, including the term may be useful, a useful means of more effectively communicating the report conclusions to the general public. So it should be noted, however, that the committee's use of the term should not be interpreted as an endorsement, simply a way of linking the work that we've done with language that's common in the bioidentical hormone therapy space. Also, for purposes of this report, the word replacement was removed from the term compounded identical hormone replacement therapy to compounded identical hormone therapy to avoid the implication that the hormone therapy is targeted at replacing hormone concentrations to the levels that were present in young adults. Throughout this report, the remainder of the presentation, CBHT, will be used. Finally, the committee research charge was to examine clinical utility of CBHT. However, the committee's review of the literature, including peer-reviewed articles, developed, so the committee developed the term for the purposes of its report and its own definition. We'll briefly explain the term on the next slide. The committee defined clinical utility as a multidimensional construct that reflects evidence about safety, effectiveness, and therapeutic need. Patient preference is also included as a component, reflecting individual decision-making based on how each person accepts benefits and risks. The committee also noted that evidence-based decisions regarding the clinical utility may evolve over time with additional studies. To address the committee's charge, the committee carefully examined each component: safety, effectiveness, therapeutic need, and patient preference of clinical utility throughout the report. Next slide. In addition to oral public testimony, the committee conducted a literature studies focused on safety and effectiveness of CBHT preparations. We examined written testimonies and other evidence with respect to materials submitted by various stakeholders. The stakeholders that provided us with additional material included, but were certainly not limited to, external or non-commissioned literature reviews, survey data on quality, safety, and costs, reported adverse events, lists of common abbreviations, and common rationales for use. All of the information that was gathered and shared with the committee were used to support or improve the committee's findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Next slide, please. To assess the study's charge, the committee conducted structured literature search to identify peer-reviewed publications and which were related to CBHT. The initial search identified more than 11,000 references. Of those articles, additional articles were pulled using terms like compounding, compounded, bioidentical, and any of the committee's prioritized hormones in the title keywords. Applying these specific terms provided the committee with less than 50 articles relevant to the committee's charge. The committee members with expertise in clinical trials, adverse events, safety, and effectiveness then carefully reviewed the additional initial findings and used that data to support or build and structure the committee's overviews and recommendations. These committees identified a total of 13 committee members identified a total of 13 studies related to CBHT, and these were the specific focus of adequate methodological rigor in its considerations for review of safety and effectiveness of these preparations. To perform the research conclusions, the committee mixed evidence from those that it identified plus those shared by ad hoc participants or identified during the public meetings. The committee recognized that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for researchers to conduct randomized controlled trials on each unique formulation of CBHT. However, the randomized controlled trials in particular are essential for studies of treatments intended to produce therapeutic effect, and these were included in the review of the committee. In addition, the committee also considered important methodological rigor, such as overall quality, cohort studies, case reports, and submitted methodological testimonies to the reviewed additional literature. Next slide. The next few slides will provide important background information on the report's conclusions and on accommodations. And I'd like to turn the discussion over to Dr. Robert MacArthur. Robert?
Thank you, Don. Okay, so the committee was asked to assess the use of CBHT. To do this, we considered three potential uses of BHT. That is, FDA-approved products that are prescribed according to their label indication. Secondly, FDA-approved products that are prescribed off-label. And thirdly, compounded bioidentical hormone therapies. There are a large number of FDA-approved hormone therapy products, including FDA-approved bioidentical hormone therapy products, with label indications for reducing symptoms associated with menopause and male hypogonadism. FDA-approved bioidentical hormone therapy products can be used off-label, such as prescribing testosterone for conditions related to female sexual dysfunction. The prescribing of FDA-approved hormone therapies, both on-label and off-label, should be aligned with clinical guidance and supported by scientific evidence. The committee also explored whether there are possibly a small number of patients with unique clinical needs for compounded medications, such as documented allergy to a component of an FDA-approved hormone therapy, for patients that might have a medical indication for a different dosage form or dose, where there is no FDA-approved dosage form or dose available for that indication. Next slide, please. Compounding has held a very long and important history in the practice of pharmacy, medicine, and patient care. It can be defined as the process of altering or combining ingredients to create medications that are tailored to meet the specific clinical needs of an individual patient. These medications represent therapeutic alternatives for patients whose clinical needs are not met by available FDA-approved products. Historically, compounding is a small-scale, patient-specific activity, and the products produced undergo limited testing and have limited regulatory oversight. As such, compounded medications are not subject to the same level of extensive testing and stringent regulatory oversight as commercially available FDA-approved products. In addition, at the state level, oversight of compounding is limited and varies widely from state to state. And finally on this slide, there appears to be a growing trend in use of CBHT following release of the Women's Health Initiative studies. Next slide, please. This figure compares select steps within the statutory and regulatory processes for FDA-approved drug products versus compounded medications. The top bar is the NDA path, or the 505(b)(1) path. The middle bar is the 503A compounding path. And the bottom bar is the 503B compounding path. Note that in the top bar, you have sub-arrows that include formulation, toxicology testing, clinical trials, review of data by both sponsor and FDA, in many cases, approval of the product, and that's followed by commercial manufacturing, distribution, and adverse event reporting. This figure is intended to provide a general overview of the statutory and regulatory processes and does not offer a complete summary of the complex regulatory framework for all drug products or all compounded products. But note that FDA does not approve compounded medications. So in the figure, you'll note that there's no yellow arrow in the middle bar or lower bar. The detailed review of safety and efficacy required for FDA-approved products is not required for CBHT preparations. In addition, the graphic points out that adverse event reporting is not required from 503A pharmacies. That's the middle bar. Next slide, please. While FDA provides some regulations for compounding preparations, state pharmacy boards retain primary responsibility for the regulation and oversight of 503A compounding pharmacies. Importantly, the frequency and content of state board pharmacy inspections varies greatly by state. Using data collected from the National Associations of Boards of Pharmacies and the Pew Charitable Trust organizations, as well as certain state-specific regulation, the committee compiled two figures, which we'll show you, to demonstrate the large variability in state requirements for 503A compounding pharmacy compliance with USP Chapters 795 and 797. They, respectively, are standards for non-sterile compounding and sterile compounding. So the figure in the slide in dark blue shows those states that require full compliance with USP 795, non-sterile compounding standards, which contrasts to the other states, which are represented in different colors, where select level of compliance or no compliance data were available. Next slide, please. This is a similar graphic, this time depicting state compliance with USP 797 sterile compounding standards. So the states noted in dark blue require full compliance with USP 797, and that contrasts with the states in other colors with select level of compliance or for which no data were available. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on to the main focus of the study charge, which is the assessment of clinical utility of treating patients with compounded bioidentical hormone preparations, presented by the Vice Chair, Dr. Ruth Parker. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Don and committee members. Let me begin by reminding you with how the committee defined clinical utility. Clinical utility is a multi-dimensional construct that reflects evidence about safety, effectiveness, and therapeutic need. Patient preference is also a component of clinical utility, reflecting patients' individual decision-making based on how each person accepts benefits and risk. The committee reviewed the evidence on each of these components in this definition, and I'll now highlight our conclusions regarding each component and then provide our overarching conclusion regarding clinical utility. Next slide, please. The committee highlighted several areas of concern regarding the regulation and oversight that relate specifically to safety and effectiveness. These areas of concern include inadequate labeling requirements. Currently, CBHT preparations are not adequately labeled. Missing information includes, but is not limited to, a description of the preparation's instructions for use, contraindications, potential adverse effects, boxed warnings, and the identity of the person and company responsible for a compounded preparation's quality and safety. This lack of information undermines safe and effective use by patients and prescribers. Another area of concern, lack of required pharmacokinetic and bioavailability data. The paucity of reliable pharmacokinetic and bioavailability data for CBHT preparations as compared to FDA-approved drug products compromises the ability to evaluate the safety, efficacy, and product-to-product variability of CBHT preparations. The committee determined that strengthening federal and state regulatory oversight, as well as requirements for transparency and disclosure of conflicts of interest, could contribute to safer, more effective use of compounded preparations, including compounded bioidentical hormone therapy. Next slide, please. Based on data described within Chapter 7 of the report, the committee reached the following conclusions. There is a dearth of high-quality evidence, data from studies that would meet FDA's requirements for granting regulatory approval to a drug, available to establish whether CBHT preparations are safe and effective for their prescribed uses. There is limited and mixed quality evidence to suggest that estriol may be effective in treating certain menopausal symptoms. However, there is insufficient evidence to inform conclusions regarding the safety of estriol. Well-designed and properly controlled clinical trials are needed to clarify the potential clinical utility of estriol. In addition, there is insufficient evidence to determine the safety and effectiveness of compounded estriol in comparison to BHT products approved by the FDA or similar international bodies. Next slide, please. The majority of marketing claims about the safety and effectiveness of CBHT preparations, whether in absolute terms or in comparison to FDA-approved BHT, are not supported by evidence from well-designed, properly controlled studies. And well-designed and properly controlled clinical trials are needed to provide reliable evidence about the safety and effectiveness of CBHT preparations. In addition, the committee expressed concerns with the voluntary and incomplete nature of adverse event reporting for compounded preparations. There is a lack of an easily accessible safety database, and this limits assessment of the frequency, type, and severity of adverse events related to the use of CBHT. Improved monitoring of adverse events is required in order to characterize the safety of these compounded preparations. Next slide, please. Relatedly, the committee identified safety and effectiveness concerns related to the formulation of CBHT. Specifically, all 10 steroid hormones of interest may be difficult to formulate, which in turn complicates drug delivery, impacts bioavailability, can complicate analytical testing, and can lead to variable CBHT product stability over time. The chemical properties which can make formulation difficult include, but are not limited to, low water solubility, differential lipid solubility, effects of particle size, possible presence of polymorphs, and potency. Also, route of administration can impact hormone metabolism, which also impacts bioavailability. For CBHT pellets, their formulations may also be difficult to compound given the complexity of drug delivery mechanism, lack of required bioavailability testing, insufficient guidance for compounders, and the need for specialized equipment. Given the broad scope of available CBHT pellet formulations marketed for use and questions regarding difficulty in compounding, there are concerns for safety and effectiveness. Next slide, please. To further assess the clinical utility of CBHT, the committee reviewed the available evidence related to patients' therapeutic need, preference, and overall use of CBHT. Next slide. The committee reviewed relevant data from the limited peer-reviewed literature, evidence-based clinical guidance from medical societies and organizations such as the American Medical Association, North American Menopause Society, and the Endocrine Society. In addition, collected testimonies from patients, clinicians, and compounding pharmacists, and considered submitted data from key stakeholders, such as nonprofit women's health advocacy organizations and organizations that advocate for natural health solutions. Next slide. Evidence-based clinical guidance recommends use of FDA-approved drug products for the treatment of menopause and male hypogonadism symptoms. They express concern with quality, safety, and effectiveness of CBHT and caution against use in lieu of FDA-approved BHT. Some, but not all, guidance notes potential for limited use of CBHT in specific medical circumstances. For example, patients with allergies to specific components of FDA-approved hormone therapy, or patients that require a dosage form not currently available as an FDA-approved drug product. Based on a review of the evidence, we were unable to identify any life-threatening medical conditions requiring CBHT. Next slide, please. Survey data suggests there may be tens of millions of prescriptions issued to patients each year, and there may be tens of thousands of different CBHT formulations, although one submitted testimony proposed an estimate of nearly 150,000 different preparations. Published survey data estimate 26 to 33 million prescriptions per year and upwards of $2 billion spent on CBHT per year. Based on a limited number of qualitative studies, patients, largely women, taking CBHT are thought to be simultaneously pushed away from FDA-approved BHT and pulled toward CBHT by conflicting psychosocial forces. Such forces include personalized medicine, marketing claims of safety and effectiveness, and distrust in healthcare and pharmaceutical industries. Some data suggest that patients and some prescribers may not be aware that CBHT medications are not FDA approved. Next slide. Based on the review of available evidence, the committee concluded the following about patient preference for CBHT. There's a lack of easily accessible, accurate, and understandable information about CBHT, leading to widespread misunderstanding of the regulation, safety, and effectiveness of CBHT preparations. This lack of information may impact patient and provider risk-benefit considerations. The current volume and scope of CBHT use contrasts with evidence-based clinical guidance issued by professional medical societies and organizations that recommend limited to no use of CBHT preparations for menopausal symptoms. The committee concluded that in the absence of safety and effectiveness data of CBHT, aspects of patient preference should not be the sole driver for use. Next slide. Through anecdotal testimonies and some qualitative studies, the committee was made aware of the strong preferences for individualized treatment among certain individuals who use CBHT. However, safety and effectiveness are foundational to assessing overall clinical utility. Given the paucity of data on the safety and effectiveness of CBHT, the committee concluded that there is insufficient evidence to support the overall clinical utility of CBHT as a treatment for menopause and male hypogonadism symptoms. Next slide, please. Given the dearth of evidence to support many of the marketed claims for the clinical utility of CBHT as a treatment of menopausal and male hypogonadism symptoms, the committee issued several recommendations to address public health concerns related to the widespread use of these medications. The committee recommends restricted use of CBHT, assessments of their difficulty to compound, and additional education, oversight, and research. I'll turn back to Dawn now to present the next slides with the specifics of the recommendations. Thank you.
The recommendations. The first recommendation concludes that prescribers and compounding pharmacists should restrict the use of CBHT preparations to documented allergy and to an active pharmaceutical ingredient or excipient, or a requirement for a different dosage form. Patient preference alone should not determine the use of CBHT preparations. In general, the potency of CBHT preparations should not exceed those of FDA-approved hormone therapy products because of the potential safety concerns. Any use of CBHT, including therapy for gender dysphoria, should align with established clinical guidance and include documentation of shared decision-making and rigorous monitoring for long-term risks. Prescribers and compounding pharmacists should clearly explain the limited evidence concerning safety and effectiveness of CBHT preparations and inform patients that compounded preparations are not FDA approved. Next slide, please. Due to safety and efficacy concerns related to the lack of bioavailability data and product-to-product variability as a result of drug formulation differences, including stability and quality control, the committee recommends that the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee review select bioidentical hormone therapies and dosage forms as candidates for the FDA difficult to compound list. Specifically, the Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee should review the bioidentical hormones reviewed in this report, as well as pellet dosage forms. Next slide, please. The committee recommends that stakeholders advocate for and work to improve education for prescribers and pharmacists who market, prescribe, compound, and dispense CBHT preparations. For prescribers, state medical boards, the Federation of State Medical Boards, and medical professional societies and associations should advocate for a state-level certification for clinicians who are seeking to begin or continue to prescribe CBHT. Formal clinical education should be offered in parallel with continuing education, medical education courses. Nonprofit professional organizations and societies within the medical sectors should expand and promote a broad range of educational opportunities for the practitioners using these products. Next slide. The committee recommends that additional federal and state level oversight should be implemented to better address public and clinical concerns regarding the safety and effectiveness of CBHT. On the state level, National Association of Boards of Pharmacy and state boards of pharmacy should expand and improve their oversight and review of 503A compounding pharmacies to ensure that adequate quality standards are maintained and documented for every CBHT preparation dispensed. Next slide. All 503A compounding pharmacies should provide standardized inserts for dispensed CBHT preparations. The insert should include a detailed description of preparations, formulations, including all active pharmaceutical ingredients and excipients used, and the use of established name of the drug. Clearly note that such preparations have not been approved by the FDA for use, and that bioavailability data, such as that available for FDA-approved products, are not available. Include also information on persons responsible for the quality and safety of the dispensed CBHT product. Increase surveillance capacity by monitoring, recording, and annually reporting the types of formulations, the payer and dispensing rates of CBHT preparations. Data on the volume and types of CBHT preparations dispensed should also be submitted annually to central repositories within the NABP and made available for public access. All 503A compounding pharmacies should be required to monitor and report all adverse events. Next slide, please. At the federal level, FDA should continue to incorporate public health considerations into its regulations of the manufacturing, testing, and dispensing of CBHT by 503B outsourcing facilities. These considerations should include expand requirement for 503B outsourcing facilities to provide information on the bioavailability and effectiveness of compound CBHT preparations, for example, biased and triased, all sterile preparations, including pellets, in addition to their current focus on quality, purity, and sterility. All 503B outsourcing facilities should use the standardized packet insert for dispensed CBHT preparation. In addition, all CBHT supplied by 503B outsourcing facilities should include boxed warnings for potential adverse effects for compounded prescriptions that include estrogens, estradiol, estrone, and androgens. Modify the standard CBHT MedWatch form to adequately collect and track adverse events related to CBHT use, including but not limited to potential drug-drug interactions and all active pharmaceutical ingredients and excipients in the CBHT formulation. Next slide. Prescribers and compounders of CBHT may have conflicts of interest arising from financial relationships, for example, ownerships or investment interests in specific CBHT formulations or companies. Such conflicts should be transparent, publicly accessible, and disclosed to patients at the point of care. State licensing boards should also collect and archive information on such financial relationships in a publicly accepted repository. Next slide. Finally, as the field of personalized medicine continues to expand, interest in compounded medications is likely to grow. Ensuring the safe and appropriate dosing of CBHT formulations requires evaluation of bioavailability and active ingredients included in the preparation. Therefore, to develop comprehensive evidence based on potential health benefits and risks, specific CBHT preparations, the committee recommends that public agencies, for example, National Institutes of Health and philanthropic funding organizations, should establish, provide, or increase funding for clinical, epidemiologic, and health services research to address gaps in the evidence base. Other stakeholders, including the FDA, USP, 503B and 503A compounding pharmacies, outsourcing, state medical boards and pharmacy boards should include the public health aspects of research and advocate for support of additional research. Final slides, please. And with that, our next steps in this report include the full release of the report, including highlights and recommendations for available and for download, and that address is on the slide. Additional dispensing or dissemination activities include a 4-page report brief and active web pages for exploring compounded medications, op-ed publications, and social media outreach. And with that, I think we will move to questions that will be moderated by Stephanie and shared with the committee.
Yes, thank you all. We will be kicking off our Q&A, and as I said before, if you have a question, just submit it into the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and if possible, please state your name and your affiliation. So my first question I see to the committee is that many people are drawn to compounded products because of the appeal of personalized medicine or avoiding one-size-fits-all type of treatments. So what should patients take away in exploring their options and navigating sometimes conflicting advice?
Ruth, you want to take a first cut at that?
Sure, I'm happy to. As you'll recall, the committee did a lot of work to come up with the definition of clinical utility that we incorporated onto this slide set a couple of times for you to take a look at. Safety and effectiveness are fundamental to that. The lack of evidence, high quality evidence regarding safety and effectiveness of CBHT is paramount to understanding the findings of our report. We certainly understand the large volume and the passion of many users, prescribers of CBHT, but without high quality evidence about safety and effectiveness, the committee felt like patient preference alone should not determine the use. And that's really a fundamental overarching conclusion of the work that the committee did. understanding the lack of evidence that exists, of high quality evidence, if you will, regarding the safety and effectiveness are felt to be, underscored in the findings of the report. I would ask anyone else on the committee to likewise respond to this.
Jennifer, you've thought a lot about this. Is that something you'd care to field?
She may be on mute, Don. Maybe, I don't know if Nancy would also like to respond, perhaps?
Oh, that'd be great. Nancy?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm not sure Jennifer's on today. We spent a lot of time listening to women and physicians who testified before us about their need for these compounded bioidentical hormones. But it was difficult to find published reports of the experiences more generally. And when we did look at some of the qualitative data, some of the observations were startling because there were some misunderstandings and misinformation, and we actually tried to go and access databases of existing large national studies to see what we could find about the use of these hormones and how they compared with FDA-approved bioidenticals. And over we saw that, and also from the physician surveys, although they're very small numbers of people, that online surveys or surveys conducted by the Endocrine Society and the North American Menopause Society. There was a lot of suggestions that women should be taking these compounded products as opposed to FDA products because they were safer for women with breast cancer. There just wasn't any kind of data to suggest that at all. That was of high quality, where there were placebo-controlled, well-designed studies that could support many of the qualitative experiences. At the same time, we also saw an important insights from women who said, I don't want to go to sit for an hour and wait for a 15-minute appointment and not even have the physician ask me questions and just give me a prescription and then not follow up. There was a sense of personalized medicine and the quality of the care and the quality of the relationship that really seemed to play a role. And we heard that at the public testimonies as well. I don't know if that answered your question, but I wanted to just share with you some of the qualitative information we received.
Can I just add to that, Don, by saying that there is a considerable amount of individualized treatment that can be obtained with currently available FDA-approved hormones. So that doesn't speak to what Nancy just mentioned in terms of the attention that people may get in different kinds of medical settings. But we observe that many of the that there were many opportunities to use currently available approved treatments in ways that allowed for individual differences between patients.
Thank you, David. Stephanie, can we go on to the next question?
Yes. Our next question is about estriol. As you know, estriol has been approved for use in several countries. Why did the committee determine there was insufficient evidence to support its clinical utility in compounded preparations?
David, do you want to take that?
Well, I would just add to what has already been said, that there are standards for judging the rigor of studies that are done. And those standards include the inclusion of control groups, the the efforts to reduce bias, including how the patients were blinded, how they were randomized, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria were, whether the studies had adequate sample sizes, whether the statistical methods that were used were adequate. We found very few, if any, studies that allowed us very few, if any, studies that met those criteria and that consequently would have allowed us with confidence to generalize from the findings of those studies, that they're just not there. And in fact, I mean, I think the overall recommendations of this committee very much speak to the need for acquiring the evidence that would permit us to conclude that estriol does or doesn't offer advantages over currently available treatments.
Don, Jose here. I could add to
go ahead.
Yeah, I could add to what David just said. You know, one of the issues is that, as he just said, you know, that there's some evidence. You know, there's some evidence out there to indicate that estriol has beneficial effects for some symptoms associated with menopause, for example, vaginal atrophy and also vasomotor symptoms. But, you know, as David mentioned, the problem is that there's no substantial studies that are well-designed, well-powered, double-blind, randomized placebo-controlled trials, and particular comparative studies. There's some, but not a wealth of evidence, you know, specifically to support any claims that products containing estriol are superior, they have superior efficacy than some of the FDA-approved medications. And even some of the claims of efficacy, for example, when you look specifically at bone density loss, we know that the results with estriol coming from studies done overseas, you know, they have their mixed results in there. And the mixed results are possibly because of the reasons that David explained of limitations with study design, etc. And that's the reason why our recommendations are for having those more comprehensive studies as previously described.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Joanne Egovich, who is a reporter with the Pink Sheet covering pharmaceutical manufacturing. And she asks, what percentage of total hormone replacement therapy products are compounded? And is there really a way to track the volume and scope of preparations being dispensed?
Ruth and or Leslie?
Sure. This is Leslie. I'm happy to start, and then Ruth, maybe you can chime in. You know, as Don mentioned in his summary, there's really a paucity of data available to even answer that question. We received, we had some information that provided us with wide ranges around the use of CBHT preparation. But again, the granular data that would be required to answer that question are not existing. And that's one of the reasons why we've strongly urged for there to be ongoing collection and capture of those data. Ruth, what would you add to that?
I would just underscore that we certainly found that paucity of data. We did include in the report the survey data that we were able to find in peer-reviewed citation, volume, scope, use, cost, all of those in terms of epidemiologic data. It would be wonderful to have that. And you can see in the recommendations, you know, the call for repositories of information that could be easily accessed and used. That would be incredibly helpful, as well as, you know, adverse event reporting and safety concerns. I might also have Robert comment, because Robert, you did a lot of work to help us understand what we could about the scope of compounding of BHT that's out there. And there's a robust section within the report about what we were able to pull together about that. It's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Ruth. Just briefly, you know, in comparison, the report, Chapter 5, talks about the information that's available for manufactured products, FDA-approved products, such as the Orange Book, and others, and the package inserts, for example, that include the active ingredients and the inactive ingredients, and the volume of drug products that are produced commercially is pretty well understood, and you can get to that information. But for compounded products, we tried very hard to get to more details about that type of information, number of products dispensed, active ingredients, inactive ingredients, even cost. And it's just not out there. It was not available for us to compare in any way to prescription products. So I hope that adds to answering the question. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question comes from Cynthia Stinkel at UC San Diego School of Medicine. Who will monitor the state pharmacy boards to ensure consistency in standards and meeting the requirements you have set?
Mm-hmm.
Robert or Jose, did you want to comment on that?
And maybe even Aaron.
Aaron, yes.
Aaron, yeah.
Well, I'll start, but just, you know, I know we've spoken to the National Association of Board of Pharmacies, who, you know, collectively gather information from the individual state pharmacy boards. And then there's the efforts of FDA that we're, you know, all familiar with, where they've, for 503Bs, they've set up their memorandum of understanding process. And so it would really have to be at that level. But Aaron, do you want to comment on that?
No, I think that would be right. I think that, you know, first of all, making sure that the, you know, information that was collected at the state level, or the rules or guides that were used, was publicly available, so that, you know, independent parties could, you know, could monitor what's going on and be able to compare, you know, standards used in different states. But I agree with you that oversight of what the states are doing would probably have to fall to, you know, national professional societies, you know, or it would be something that the FDA could perceive as being within its remit.
We have gotten a few questions about the recommendations or calling out compounded hormones in pellet form as a candidate for FDA's difficult to compound list. Can you specifically address the risk of pelleted hormones?
Robert? Jose?
I'll start.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, for the pelleted products, some of their aspects that made them stand out is the fact that they're controlled release dosage forms, and they're implanted subcutaneously, and they deliver drugs over weeks to months, and the dosing, at least from what's in the literature, involves multiple pellets. Let me say, actually, I should have started with this. As with the other aspects here, there's limited information about pellets to begin with. So comparatively, the dosing recommendations and manufacturing methods are not widely available. So, and that all leads to the idea of what do we know about the bioavailability of these products? Do they deliver drug consistently? Are there peaks? Are there troughs? And I think when we asked that of of the public when they came to present to us and tell us about their products, those aspects of pellet therapy really weren't presented by the groups that came before us. Jose?
No, Robert, I just wanted to add that there's not a lot of information out there from what we research in terms of consistency of pellet formulation, variability among preparations as it relates to, and lack of information in terms of, bioavailability, erratic release, from the pellet, and consistency, so those are areas in which, there's very little information that would be pretty critical, to better assess, efficacy and safety of hormones that are formulated on a pellet type formulation. Sorry for the redundancy.
And this is Don. One additional follow-up on that is that we were made available to the committee was a select set of data from the adverse event reporting systems that the FDA manages, and the pellets had the highest rate of adverse events of any of the compounded medications that were included on that list. So based on variability of formulation, the unknown characteristics of bioavailability, and the large number of adverse events attributed to pellets, that I think drew them to the attention of the committee. Sorry.
Yeah, Don, if I can just add, and for those, I'm sure most people do realize this, but it is worth stating that all of our concerns about bioavailability are not academic, because any medication that you take, which includes hormones of any kind, can have no effects, or they can have beneficial effects, or they can have toxic effects. And those effects are to a large extent determined by the levels that are achieved, by the stability of the levels, and consequently, without knowing how much of hormone someone is getting with a particular product, you don't know whether you're going to have a beneficial effect or a toxic effect.
So David, Jose Manatu here again. To add to that, I think when you look at bioavailability and release of the hormone from the pellet, we could be at either side of the spectrum. Very little below therapeutic, what would be considered to be therapeutic release of hormones from the pellet. And on the other side, a pellet that is being formulated erratically and is just releasing, either contains more than normal, or it releases, supra physiological amounts of the hormone into the systemic circulation. So as David said, either lack of efficacy or side effects associated with being on both sides of the spectrum in terms of how much of the hormone is released from the pellet when you have a formulation that is prone to erratic hormone delivery.
I would just add and underscore to that this information, the science that they've reviewed, it's good to put that in the context of the marketing claims of equal or superior safety and efficacy and effectiveness. We really do not know that. And so that's part of the concern is on the other side of this, how these products are marketed.
Actually, let me just add one more thought. And going back to the slides about the history of compounding and its role in patient care, the equipment that's required to make pellets and the process of making pellets is something that most pharmacies can't perform. So they're made in facilities that are more commercial-like than they are pharmacy-like. So in that respect, it doesn't really fit well into the traditional concept of pharmacy compounding.
Thanks. Good series of comments. Stephanie, additional questions?
Yes, and I do want to be respectful of folks' time, so we likely have time for 2 more questions. This is another one that has come up from a few people. How do we encourage collection of real-world evidence, or in other words, there are many unique formulations of CBHT preparations, and it could seem really challenging to conduct large randomized control trials to study each one. So what type of research is really needed to build the evidence base for clinical utility?
Leslie, did you want to take a crack at that? And Susan, if you're here?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Don. Thank you. And it's really a great question. The preface that you gave, that there are so many thousands, in fact, formulations of these preparations, makes it challenging, if not impossible, to do randomized trials, well-controlled randomized trials of each and every one. So I guess I would suggest a couple of things. First, I think we could focus our efforts initially on some of those that are most commonly prescribed, right? So that would be one way to focus our efforts, and then really begin to collect those prescribing data that I referenced in my earlier response. With those, we can actually then begin to plan for the randomized trials that use real-world data, use enroll patients who are actively taking these therapies, to begin to understand in a robust way the effectiveness, the safety and effectiveness of these therapies. But it really begins with collecting some basic prescribing data about what's currently happening in the real world.
Yeah, I would, I don't think Susan's on, but this is Aaron, and I just wanted to echo what Leslie said, which I think is exactly right. And I think that observational data could be very useful in helping provide insight into the safety of these products. But, you know, I think that that's very consistent with some of the recommendations we had, because in order to be able to do that, you know, do observational studies with appropriate rigor, and you really need to have more clear information about the product itself and the, you know, prescription and all of that. By a lot of the recommendations that we had about better oversight of, and more you know, clarity and transparency about the products, and bringing it into the system, will allow generation of that evidence that can then be studied in the same way that we you know, study FDA-approved drugs in their real-world use.
And I would just
Thanks,
add to that also that the committee noted that should and when such data are available from well-controlled and well done studies about safety and effectiveness, the overall clinical utility could be reconsidered, and that overarching conclusion reflects what is currently available and the materials that we reviewed at the time of this report.
Thank you. Final question. Many patients use compounded preparations due to cost. How would you advise patients and their prescribers around the cost discussion, and also in situations where there's an indication for which there are no FDA-approved options available?
Ruth, do you want to start, and then Aaron, might you have some follow-up input?
And I'm going to let Aaron speak very specifically to what we were able to ascertain about the cost. I'll give away your punchline, Aaron, which is that not much because of the lack of data, but we can certainly comment on we did attempt to look at that. But I would say that the other issue, I think, really relates to, for the public, and for individuals who are considering their own potential risk and benefit from any therapeutic intervention, and most specifically for this study, for compounded BHT, it's really important to make sure that you do have access to the best available data and evidence, that it is presented in a way that you can access it, understand conflicts of interest are made apparent if they exist, and underscoring that the committee had concerns about the lack of transparency and the lack of availability of good evidence. However, anyone considering, and people do have different tolerance for risk and benefit, and we noted that in our considerations of patient preference, making sure that you really do understand whatever is known about potential safety concerns that relate to risk, and any lack of data at this point as it relates to efficacy and effectiveness are really made clear in a way that informs decisions about use of these as therapeutics. So I would just underscore the importance of what's called shared decision-making and its reliance on easily accessible, understandable, helpful, useful information that does reflect what is and is not known about CBHRT.
And I would just add as a quick follow-up, and I want to thank Ruth for giving away the punchline. But you know, we weren't able to make a lot of conclusions about costs, but I do think that we did read a lot of reports and hear a lot about how some of these products are extremely costly, and you know, for some patients, you know, paying, you know, we you know, heard about them paying out of pocket for these kinds of products, and you know, I think that was another motivating factor for the importance of the report being conducted, and the recommendations that we're going to make, because you know, if people are going to be paying a lot of money for these for any of the products or these, they should know what they're getting, and unfortunately in too many circumstances we were finding that people were not knowing what they were getting, and so you know, I think that you know, in order to you know, try to be fair about these products, that you know, we need more information about their effectiveness and safety in order to determine you know, what the fair prices of them should be, and you know, if people are you know, how to make sure that they, you know, that people are spending their money wisely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it looks like those are all the questions we have time for today, and we had several people join the webinar, so I apologize if we didn't get to every single question. But once you exit this webinar, you'll be directed to our report page. That's nationalacademies.org/CBHT. And if you need more information about the study staff's email is up on this final page. I'd like to thank our speakers, and again, thank you all for participating today.